السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another program of Gems of the Heart, where we try to learn how to purify our hearts. And as it's always been repeated many times, that this is such a foundation of our religion, to purify our hearts. This is a constant purification that we are in need of. And for anything that we acquire in this life, we need to have two forms of power. The power of knowledge, we have to have the knowledge of how to purify ourselves. And the other set of power, and that is to implement the knowledge that we have. And the knowledge is revelation from Allah. So there's nothing more truthful than this. This is the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth. There's no way for someone to purify himself and to purify his heart, which is essential for someone to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to save oneself from the hellfire. We have to purify our hearts. So there's no way to establish this and to achieve this unless we follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. If all the human beings, they get together and they made a set of rules and set of ways to purify themselves, there's no way for them to achieve this. It has to be through the revelation, the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we take all of our matters of knowledge from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and the explanations of the ulama, those who follow the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We don't invent our ways to purify ourselves. We don't torture ourselves as some people, they might do this thinking that this is the way to elevate themselves and to purify themselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need of this whatsoever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be obedient to Him, to follow the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, being the purest man ever walked on the face of earth, and the purest heart ever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised him in the Quran in more than one verse. And the only way for us to achieve the pure heart is to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the wahy, the revelation from Allah. And the wahy, the revelation from Allah, is both the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah as part of talking about the belief in Allah, which is the first pillar of Al-Iman. As a way to purify ourselves, we have to have the foundation of the Aqidah, matters of belief, and how to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the proper way. And we've been going through the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, learning them, believing in them, getting to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and having the effect of these names in our speech and actions, and more importantly in our hearts. And knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is nothing more important than this. There is no way that someone would fulfill the purpose of his life unless we get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's nothing more important than knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the way to achieve this, the way to get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is through knowing His names and attributes. So this is not just something that a person can take as an extra thing or extra knowledge. This is mandatory for us to know. And when we talk about the names and attributes of Allah, again and again we're referring to the revelation from Allah. So we're not inventing our way of deciding or knowing what's the names and what's the attributes of Allah. It's according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We talked about many of them, and we're still, inshallah ta'ala, going to discuss these names and attributes of Allah, whatever is present in the Quran and the Sunnah, and one of which in this episode will briefly talk about two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when it comes to being the names of Allah, this is something that might have differences of opinions in one of them. These two names are, or these two attributes are, Al-Mu'ti and Al-Mani'. Al-Mu'ti means the giver, and Al-Mani' means the withholder. There are two opposites, and it's important to mention them together. And this is one of the etiquettes of learning these two names, or these attributes, is that you should not mention one and not the other. They're two opposite that gives a perfect meaning. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Mu'ti. He is the giver. And this is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Mani', there's a difference of opinion whether it's a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not. But it's no doubt, it's an attribute of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withholds That's one of the meanings of al-mana, withholding, and comes into the meaning of protection, as we will discuss it inshallah ta'ala. But first, let's talk about one and the other, and then both of them together. And this is how we get to the perfect meaning of this, and how to affect our hearts, and how to purify ourselves with knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the subject of al-ata' wal-man', the giving and withholding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-mu'ti. And this is something that we see in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. When it comes to the name specifically, al-mu'ti, it's mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And this hadith, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, مَا يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ وَإِنَّمَا أَنَا قَاسِمٌ وَيُعْطِي اللَّهُ وَالْمُعْطِي هُوَ اللَّهُ. Which means that whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make him comprehend the religion. وَاللَّهُ الْمُعْطِي وَأَنَا الْقَاسِمُ. Which means Allah is the giver, and I am al-Qasim, the one that would establish the ruling among you and distribute the ruling among you, meaning in the human sense. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Mu'ti. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the giver. So this is clearly mentioned as a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the giver of all things. And this is something that we would see in common of being the creator, the provider. But more specifically when it comes to be given. So the giver of all things is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we look also into the ayat of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Musa alayhi salam, when he said to Fir'aun that about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, رَبُّنَا الَّذِي أَعْطَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلْقَهُ ثُمَّ هَدَى. When he was explaining to Fir'aun, talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our Lord, and this is in Surah Taha, our Lord is the one that أَعْطَى كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلْقَهُ. He's the one that gave all of each thing its form and then guided it. So every created thing, all of the creation of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gave it its form. So we have been given whatever we have in this life. We have been given the fact that you are a man or a woman. You've been given these parts of our bodies. We've been given this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the ability to think, gave us the ability to breathe. He gave us the eyes and the nose and the ears and the different senses. It's all given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something that many people are heedless about. They don't think about it. They're in a state of forgetfulness. And that, of course, when a person think about it and have the proper belief in it, it brings all kinds of purification to the heart. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the giver of all creation, its form. And then He guided all of His creation, guided them to have or to fulfill the purpose of their life. Other than the human beings, like the animals for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them and their forms and their way of living and so on. And He guided them to live their life according to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. So for example, if the cow has been created for a specific job, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave what it takes for this job to be fulfilled. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the fish, that means He gave it its means to be able to live under the water and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created everything and He guided it to fulfill its job and its purpose on the face of earth. The same thing for the human being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us our form and our shape and our senses and all of that. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala guided us to be able to live on the earth in a way that is comfortable and easy. And we see how human beings, they do amazing things. And how is that? It's by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them. So the physical aspect of life, it's given to us. A person might say, but we learn. Who's the one that gave us the ability to learn? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He did not create us like the animals, but He created us not limited like them. He gave us the ability to learn, and we learn from one another and from one generation to the other. And not just learning, when a child is born, he's given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the ability to sustain his life. Who's the one that taught the child to be breastfed? No one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created him with this. Who's the one that taught the child how to breathe and how to see and how to hear? It's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ability to walk, all of that is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the more the person, have the intellect and the reason and the ability and the strength and so on, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can talk about this attribute of being given, and not just what we think of provisions or wealth and so on. This is all given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-mu'ti, is the one that gives. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon the prophets of Allah the best thing ever, which is the prophethood. He's the one that gave it to them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam al-kawthar, as the word is used in the Quran, inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. We gave you al-kawthar, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And al-kawthar is the river in Jannah, and from it will be the hawd, where the people would receive the water from the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam in the Day of Judgment. It's given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Since everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll talk about the benefits and the things for us to say even after the salah or things like this, but we need to first of all have the belief and to establish this belief in our heart that the one that gives all things is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we as human beings, we are the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His favor upon us for a reason, and that is to worship Him alone subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a result of this, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he was the best, as we said, and as we all believe. And therefore, how he alayhi salatu wasalam looked at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withholds, because this has misunderstanding to many people on the face of earth. People think that this life, if a person is given materialistic, physical matters on the face of earth, that means, since it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means Allah is pleased with him. And if someone has been withheld, materialistic matters, wealth, health, whatever there is, people might think, and many of them, they have this misconception, that it's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't like the person. We have to understand certain things, and that is, when it comes to giving or withholding, and since it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's by the wisdom of Allah. He gives by His power and knowledge and wisdom subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the most merciful. So when He withholds also, He does not withhold because, wal-'iyadhu billah, out of greed or out of scarcity, He doesn't have much to give. Wal-'iyadhu billah. This is all belief, or this is disbelief basically, if a person believes that way. But rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He gives with the wisdom, and He's the most wise. And He's the most wise that even sometimes we do not understand, many times, we do not understand the wisdom or the outcome of what has been given to us. But we know in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ what's our job. How to deal with these things that are given to us. How to deal with our life that is given to us. How to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. How to deal with whatever is given to us, whether it's health, wealth, relationships, whatever we are given something, we know that there are rulings and regulations and guidelines for us to fulfill the purpose of our life based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us. So if someone, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the ability to walk, there are extra responsibilities for that person than someone, for example, does not have the ability to walk. For example, how to establish the salah. Someone can stand versus someone that is not able to stand, and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the bestower of all things, and therefore, when we receive something, we should not think immediately it's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with me. We have to think good about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes. But it's basically, in this life, it's a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when a person is then, on the other hand, has been taken away something from him, he's been made to be poor, he's taken other means, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, withheld something from him. And that's by the wisdom of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing him. Whether he will worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on that, whether he would see it as something given. And this is a high level of understanding these two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The believers, they see al-ata, or when they are given something, They see it as a favor from Allah, so they need to be grateful to Allah, and they would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And when there's something has been taken away from them, or others they have it and they don't have it, the believers, they see that as in itself as a ata, or as something given. So you are been given the withholding of something, if it's easy to understand. That means a person has been given the fact that he's poor, that he's been withheld from him, for example, abundance and wealth. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most wise. Nothing happens except by the wisdom of Allah. There's a reason. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most wise. So that you, as a human being, when something is withheld from you, you need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly. You need to be patient. You need to be pleased with Allah. You need to have good expectations of Allah, that maybe, which is not maybe, but really to have that strong belief that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for you, of course you take the means and all of this, whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed, He decreed what is best for you according to your reaction to it. So if you're patient, if you're still obedient to Allah, this would elevate the person. And people go through many stages in their life. So living our life with this way of witnessing the ata and the man', who's been given and who's been withheld. And there are many ways that we can think about this. One of which is that the Prophet ﷺ, this is one of the effects of believing in this, that he would say certain things at the end of the salah, as we know the adhkar, to be said after finishing the salah. One of which is that the Prophet ﷺ, after he finished the obligatory salah, he would say, La ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulk wa lahul hamd, wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. اللهم لا مانع لما أعطيت ولا معطي لما منعت ولا ينفع ذا الجد منك الجد. After stating كلمة التوحيد, which is the most important thing ever. There's no one worthy of worship except Allah. The dominion of the heavens and the earth belong to Him. All of the perfect praise is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He's able to do all things. After stating this belief, then he would say, اللهم لا مانع لما أعطيت. There's no mani'. There's no one withhold what you give. If you give, no one whatsoever will be able to withhold it. وَلَا مُعْطِي لِمَا مَنَعْتَ. And there's no one would give what you already withheld. There's no way, because other than Allah are creation of Allah, in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a matter of belief, and the tongue, when a person says it every time he finishes the salah, what is the effect of that in the heart? It's an amazing purification of the heart. When we say purification of the heart, the most thing that pollutes the heart is, of course, the shirk, associating partners with Allah, and any attachment of the heart to other than Allah. This is the worst pollution to the heart. This is the job that we need to constantly purify our hearts from having any attachment to the creation of Allah, and to have the hearts fully attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one of the ways to purify our hearts, because when we live our life, we're constantly every day, either we are given something or something has been withheld from us. Many people, young people for example, they all wish to be very rich, having the most sophisticated car and the most spacious house and all of these types of desire of this world. Nothing wrong with having all kinds of good means in this life, as long as it's halal and permissible. But when a person sees himself that maybe others, they might not have what he has of intellect and abilities and so on, but they are so rich, you always receive, especially the time that we live in, that you would find sometimes people that become super rich from nothing, or others, they would take the same means, but they don't get into the same level, or they don't get anything basically sometimes. Or things that are sometimes sinful. Or someone, we're living at times, if someone just sometimes make a goofy video of something, he finds himself, becomes a very famous person, and all kinds of wealth would pour onto him. And sometimes when they have the lack of knowledge, they might fall into what the people of Musa alayhi salam, at the time of Musa alayhi salam, when his cousin Qarun, he had so much wealth, and the people of ignorance, those who were attached, their hearts were attached to this world, They said, يَا لَيْتَ لَنَا مِثْلَ مَا أُوتِيَ قَارُونَ. They said, we wish we have what Qarun has. Many people have this in their hearts. And it's a normal thing, by the way, to have that instant of desiring something to be in our hearts. But we have to be immediately thinking and witnessing, while we're taking the means perfectly, that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decree for us, we are pleased with it. So this is not a call for someone to be lazy. We're talking about the actions of the heart. So whatever profession, whatever occupation that a person is in, and a person is taking the means, halal ways of course, and not haram, taking the means, but the heart is settled. The heart is content with whatever the outcome, and that is the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the provisions from Allah, because at the end, who is the mu'ti? Who's the giver? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you take all of the means and something has been taken away from you, or something that you wanted so bad but you were not given that thing from the materialistic thing of this life, then immediately the believers are pleased. Why? Because they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most wise. There's a wisdom behind it. There's a wisdom behind it because it's all by the most wise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is, even though we're talking about the benefits now, but this is part of the belief. This is how to believe in these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we said, these are two names, but some said that it's only the first one because it's mentioned in the hadith, but not the second one. But as a fact, it's all attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we need to witness these meanings and to see how can we live our lives according to these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala with more benefits in these two names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Mu'ti and Al-Mana', after the break, so stay with us inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back, and we're talking about the two names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Mu'ti, Al-Mana', the giver, the bestower, and the one that withholds. And as we said again, the first one, Al-Mu'ti, is one of the names of Allah, but the second one, there's differences of opinions whether it's a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not, but no doubt that it's one of the attributes of Allah. A person might ask, why there's differences of opinions? Isn't it something that should be with consensus among the people of knowledge? Some of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, has consensus among the ulama. This is what is mentioned clearly in the Quran or the authentic sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But when we talk about the names of Allah, it's very limited to what is mentioned in the Quran and the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a name. When we talk about a name, it's different than we're talking about the attributes. Every name of Allah, of course, the name itself is an attribute of Allah. So when we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, As-Sami', the all-hearer, this is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called As-Sami', and it has the attribute of Allah, which is the attribute of As-Sam', or the attribute of hearing, and nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, these names, it has to be mentioned clearly in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ as a name. So when it comes to the attributes, it's much spacious than this. So the attributes of Allah, anything, any attribute that is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, but not in the context of that this is a name, then you would find many, many of the attributes of Allah. So that's why when we say there's differences of opinion whether Al-Mana' is a name of Allah or not, but no doubt Al-Man', which is the attribute, withholding something, this is one of the attributes of Allah, because He's the one that gives and He's the one that withholds and takes away. All of that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's another meaning that the ulama mentioned when it comes to withholding, or Al-Mana' or Al-Man', comes from the same word that people would use for protection. So the one that protects the believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that would protect them and withhold away from them the ways of their enemies and the harm from their enemies. So this is something even in the Arabic language, that so and so is mana'a for his people. Mana'a from the mana', that means his protection. He's someone that withholds, someone that would push away the harm from the people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that protects his slaves and give them victory and aid them and protect them from the harms of their enemy. And this is another meaning of the attribute of Al-Man' or Al-Mana', as the ulama mentioned. So two things when it comes to the mana', the one that withholds, whether it's provisions, whether it's health, more time to live on the earth, anything that is being withheld. You know, you can make 10 billions, and you can make 10, only, or whatever there is. This is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything else in our life. So therefore, this is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whether this is the meaning or the meaning of protection and protecting the believers and pushing away harm from them and so on. And with that meaning, when it comes to the protection, the Prophet ﷺ, one time when they were traveling, and the Prophet ﷺ slept under a tree, and he had his sword not with him in his hand ﷺ. And one of the disbelievers, he came and he saw the Prophet ﷺ like this, so he took the sword of the Prophet ﷺ, and at that moment the Prophet ﷺ woke up. And this man said to the Prophet ﷺ, "Man yamna'uka minni?" He said to the Prophet ﷺ, who would yamna'uk? It's the same word of al-mana' or al-man'. Who would withhold you from me? Who would protect you from me? Who would prevent me and withhold me from attacking you or killing you? The Prophet ﷺ, in a very calm way, with the heart attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said Allah. And he said Allah 3 times. This man kept saying, and the Prophet ﷺ said Allah. Allah is the one that will protect me and withhold your harm from me. The sword from this man fell from his hand. And the Prophet ﷺ took it and he said to him, now who would withhold you from me? And the man said, Kun khayr akhidh, which means be the best of a taker. Like you took this, be the best. And the Prophet ﷺ, of course, he was asking him, but he did not harm him. He did not do any harm to him. But he wanted to teach him a lesson, that to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That person continued to be a disbeliever, but the point here is the Prophet ﷺ, in which we need to imitate his way. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do so, he had that belief, of course, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that would protect, He's the one that withhold the harm. So anything that happens to a person on the face of earth is meant to be this way. So instead of really looking at the human beings and being attached to the human beings and being scared and fearing other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to take the means, we need to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's no need for us to fear other than Allah. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will for a person to be protected, if the entire human beings, the entire population of the whole world, they get together and they plot and they plan and they take the means and they put the effort and get to their arms and their effort and everything to cause harm to one person, they won't be able to do that unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit for it to happen. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit for it to happen, that means there's a great wisdom behind it. And it's all by the most wise, the most high, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the meaning of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he taught Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, when he was almost by the age of puberty, he taught him these words, and one of which, that wa'lam, have the knowledge, have the certainty. wa'lam أن الأمة لو اجتمعت على أن ينفعوك بشيء. If the entire ummah, the entire people on the earth, they get together to try to benefit you of something, لم ينفعوك بشيء, they would never be able to benefit you with anything except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for you. And the opposite is true. وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْأُمَّةِ, if the entire ummah, the entire people on the face of earth, they get together trying to harm you with anything, they won't harm you except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for you. That's the belief in the qadr of Allah. And that's the most effective purification of our hearts when it comes to anything that we have on the face of earth, whether it's physical matters or religious matters. So the purification of the heart for someone to be obedient to Allah, that's a favor from Allah. For someone to be given the Quran, it's one of the best favors ever. For someone to be given the Quran, meaning to have the ability to learn the Quran, to recite the Quran, to memorize the Quran, to act upon the Quran. That's the best favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for someone to be among the people of the Quran. For the believers to seek that from Allah and to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If someone is given a content heart, having the contentment and not being distracted in this life, it's a give. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave someone this. He subhanahu wa ta'ala the one that gives this. and not just to limit it into matters of materialistic issues. It's the matter of al-iman, it's the richness of the heart, it's the happiness of this life and in the hereafter. The fact that a person is able and guided to make dhikr of Allah. How many times we would find ourselves not able to make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when a person is given the ability, this is a great favor from Allah, and so on. So then the heart of the believers is purified when they seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them from His bounties subhanahu wa ta'ala. To ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His bounties in this life and in the hereafter. And the best of all is to be obedient to Allah, to be steadfast on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also, as as we heard to say after the salah, this dua is to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives and the one that withholds and the one that protects, something that has a great effect in our life. And then when we look into these benefits and how to purify ourselves and our hearts, as we heard, the believers would not fear other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Would not ask anyone but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He's the one that is the giver in reality. And the human beings are nothing but means. The person would, his life will change. We would find ourselves asking from the bounties of Allah. وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from His bounties. How can a day passes without asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? A person would hear the ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَتَاكُم مِّن كُلِّ مَا سَأَلْتُمُوهُ, that He give you from whatever, all things that you ask for. Sometimes we think of this verse as a person, I asked for such and such and I was not given that thing. But oftentimes we are given things that we're not asking for, and we are forgetful enough to be heedless and not to think of it as something has been given to Allah. Imagine that we have to make dua to Allah to be able to breathe every day. How many times you need to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for inhaling and exhaling? And how many breaths we take every day? What's the average? Allah knows best. You can count. How many thousands of times. This is every time we have the ability to breathe, and every time we have the ability to exhale. This is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's given to us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do we ask for it? Do we sit and ask for it? This is a great favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if someone wants to see, when someone has problem in breathing, someone have an asthma, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cure all those who are sick. So a person would then appreciate or see the great favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure him. But when it's given, you would find the ignorance of the human being that we don't ask. So the same thing with provisions. If we're not having the food of the day, what happens? We'll be very weak and not able to function and so on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the bestower of all things. He gives us all of these bounties. But then you would find the human beings being miserable and sad about trivial things or things that are not important. And that's another thing that shaitan works on the people when it comes to these meanings. A brother was mentioning something that is a good reminder. Like many times people ruin their happiness on the face of earth when they overlook the bounties of Allah, and they're so confined to the things that disturb them or bother them on a daily basis. Even for simplest examples. Someone, for example, is working, he has a job, and something happens in his job that disturbs him and make him sad. It ruins his happiness, but he overlooked the fact that he's working. At least he's having some provisions. He has a job, but something happens in there, make him forget the original bounty from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that maybe he was extremely happy when he attained this position. Or the same thing when a parent is so upset and stressed because of the bad behavior or the difficulties of raising children, but overlooking the fact that this is a bounty from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that a person was so happy when that first happened. So why ruining our own goodness and calmness and happiness because of some things that happens? And it's all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us many, many things, endless things. We cannot even count them, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. And we can even see that in just one bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ability to breathe. So you can add to it ability to move and to see and to hear. And the most important of all of this is to be guided, is to be a Muslim, is to be able to pray 5 times a day. How many people are deprived from this? How many people this has been withheld from them? And that's the worst thing ever, when a person is not able to make sujood. That the heart is so sealed up, that a person has so much arrogance that he doesn't want to put his head on the ground in prostration, in sujood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is man'. This is being withheld from him, this great bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of the evil of that person, arrogance, whatever there is, not seeing the truth. So the point here is when a person sees, the ability to do these things, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we talk about examples, then we need a series of episodes, because we would never be able to count them all. But it's a way for us to practice this in our life, and to see the effect of these names and attributes in our life when it comes to the subject or giving and withholding. As we said, one of the very important benefits here, we should not be like those who, when they are given, they're happy and pleased. And whenever something is taken away from them, or they're not been given something, while they're taking the means for it, they're not pleased and they're not happy and they're not content. This is a bad sign, of course. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemned this and revealed in the Quran verses about this. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ. Some of the people, they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the edge. فَإِنْ أَصَابَهُ خَيْرٌ اطْمَأَنَّ بِهِ. If goodness happens to that person, is been given by Allah goodness, wealth, health, whatever there is, اطْمَأَنَّ بِهِ. He will find himself in state of tranquility, he's happy. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ فِتْنَةٌ انْقَلَبَ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. And if fitna afflicts him, a trial from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he will fall on his face, because he's on the edge. His ibadah, his obedience to Allah is on the edge. It depends on how his life will be. If it's good, he will be good. If it's not good, he will fall into his face. Many people, they do this, and as a result of that, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, as we see, خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. He would lose the dunya, this life, and the hereafter. ذَلِكَ وَالْخُسْرَانُ الْمُبِينَ. This is the clear loss. So we need to redefine what is loss and what is gain, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives and the one that withholds. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to worship Him alone, anything that we are given to help us to establish this purpose of our life, this is a great favor from Allah. Anything that is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it makes us away from fulfilling the purpose of our life, to commit sins and so on, that means this is not a good thing for us, even though it's given to us by Allah. But the way that we react to it, the way that we receive it and we act according to it, it ruins us. So we have to make sure that anything that we are given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to fulfill the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regarding to it. And anything that is not given to us, that is withheld from us, we have to consider it as is given. It's something given to us. It's a favor from Allah. And this is in all matters. Of course, a sin is not a favor of Allah. A person should then fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with repentance and seeking forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we would see also in the other meaning, which is al-man', when a person is being withheld something. We would see that when a person is being withheld the ability to be obedient to Allah, that should bring the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our hearts. This is the real deprivation, when a person is deprived from the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes even some of the believers, they would have as a whisper of shaitan that the people of this worldly gain and sinful life and so on, a person might think they're having more fun than someone that is obedient to Allah, enjoying more of their life than someone that is obedient to Allah. Maybe the people of sin, those who are forgetful, they might think this way. And this is all false belief and false feelings. It's not the truth. The truth is that the people, those who are obedient to Allah, and the hearts are purified with the obedience of Allah, they know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, this is the real joy for them. And that's why when the early generations of Islam, they would say this. They would say that if what we find in our hearts This is the level of purification of the hearts, that if the kings and the son of the kings, they would know this, and if they have the ability, they would fight us with their swords to have it. People think that if they have power and wealth, they can attain anything in the world. No, you cannot attain the happiness and the contentment of the heart. You can attain all kinds of physical things. You can have wealth, you can have power, you can do many things. But the hearts are owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and everything else. So the contentment, the happiness, the real joy of this life is when these hearts fulfilling its purpose, when it's full of the words of Allah, being obedient to Allah, seeing and witnessing that the giving and withholding is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as a fact that whoever wants something, he should seek it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا يُنَالُ مَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا بِطَاعَتِهِ. And the only way to attain things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is by the obedience of Allah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of these meanings and to make us among those who complete their iman and purify their hearts by the names and attributes of Allah. So till next time, with another name and attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I leave you with the protection of Allah. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.